My name is Anne Whealton, and I'm here interviewing Gary Turnquist. And we are sitting in his lovely house, which he has restored, and his wife, Alan, have restored. It's about 100-year-old fisherman's house. Very interesting, very, very cute. It's located on Savage Street on the northern end of Chincoteague Island in Virginia. And we're here to talk about cemeteries on the island. Gary has an expertise in cemeteries and is very aware of the history of the cemeteries on the island and has an interest in it. So this is something that we would like to cover for the Island Library Oral History Project. How are you today, Gary?
I am fine today, Anne.
Good.
I'm glad we've got everything up and running this morning.
Yes, I am too. All right, and by the way, today is Wednesday, November 16th, 2005. I'm going to start out the interview by asking Gary, where were you born? And tell me a little bit about your youth, if you don't mind.
Okay. My name is Gary Turnquist. I was originally born in Detroit, Michigan, where I was raised until the age of 19 actually, when I went into the military. Detroit at that time in the 50s and 60s was a very nice place to live and grow up in. There's a lot of cultural influence there in theaters and museums. And at that particular time, I had a very good childhood there. I went into the military in 1967 and pretty much never went back to Detroit.
Which branch of the military were you?
I was in the Army. I was in the Army Security Agency, okay. And I ended up spending a year and a half. My tour of duty was in northern Ethiopia, in the town of, it was now the country of Eritrea, in the town of Asmara, which was a very interesting thing for me. I ended up ultimately teaching 9th grade ancient history at the University of Asmara for a year while I was there.
Wow.
After I got out of the service in 1972, I had met Ellen and we were married. We spent a half a year in Morocco on our honeymoon, and when we returned from Morocco, we both went out to Albuquerque, New Mexico, where we attended the University of New Mexico. Mm-hmm. And my original undergraduate studies were in anthropology and archaeology at the University of New Mexico, which is one of the things that got me interested in cemeteries.
Oh, fantastic.
As cemeteries, my main focus of research is in an area what is known as material culture.
Okay. And
cemetery stones basically represent material culture in the built environment that I guess you could say remains for a very long period of time.
Okay.
There's a great deal of temporal continuity with cemeteries. Mm-hmm. Certainly within a particular area. Mm-hmm. After the University of New Mexico, we moved to western North Carolina in the mountains, where I worked in architectural restoration and furniture conservation for 23 years. Along the way, I also gone back to the University of, or Appalachian State University, and picked up another degree in public and applied history, which is also a field that deals with material culture. And public and applied history is an area of history that necessarily, if you're not teaching history or strictly researching it, it deals with more of the public aspects of it, mm-hmm. Where I was able to continue a lot of my cemetery research.
Okay. Now, what brought you to the island?
My wife, well, we'd lived in the mountains for 23 years, and after our kids finished school, it presented us with an opportunity for change. And Ellen had always wanted to live by the shore, and so that was an easy enough change for us to make from the mountains to the sea. Mm-hmm. So it was largely because Ellen had always wanted to live here that brought us to Chincoteague Island. After many years of living in the Appalachian Mountains, it's difficult to find another spot to live that's not complicated and overridden with traffic and too fast-paced. And the Eastern Shore seemed a nice place to be, and Chincoteague Island seemed a nice spot to locate on.
You think being by the water, is that Scandinavian?
It probably is, between the mountains and the water, yeah. I mean, I guess you wouldn't want to be in the Piedmont and, somewhere in between, so.
That's great.
But at any rate, that's a brief biographical sketch of my background. Largely, my concentration in archaeology is what brought me into cemetery research, because archaeology deals in many respects with that particular aspect. If you were to take history and figure out what aspect of history, historical studies, cemetery research falls into, it would undoubtedly be the archaeological aspect of it, of past cultures and how people deal with that particular aspect of their life situation.
Okay. Well, let me start out on the island with where the graves and the cemeteries are located.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. This is a more rural area as opposed to in the city. There might be one big cemetery and everybody goes to that one cemetery. What is different about the cemeteries on Chincoteague Island from what we're used to in the cities?
Well, it's not so much what we're used to in the cities. It's not that they're different. What is similar about the cemeteries on Chincoteague Island is that they fall into a pattern that is known as the Southern Rural Folk Cemetery.
Okay.
And the Southern Folk Cemeteries basically have both an upland as well as a lowland contingent to the way that they're structured. And the cemeteries here fit into a particular folk cemetery pattern, which is predominant throughout the entire South.
Okay.
And largely, the characteristics that define Southern folk cemeteries are east-west grave orientation.
Okay. What is east-west?
In other words, the heads are basically pointed to the west. The feet are oriented to the east.
Okay.
And the traditional explanation for this is that when Jesus comes again, he will come in the east, and everybody will be able to rise up and be facing the east.
Okay.
It's a very traditional way of orienting graves. In the mountains, I saw situations where, because of the slope, great pains were taken to still maintain an east-west orientation.
Okay.
There are a couple of spots on the island where this isn't normally taken 100%, where they vary just a little bit because of the way that the cemetery was laid out. But in real folk situations, sometimes you can find people that were if they're doing it on a dead reckoning basis according to the sun, you will oftentimes see a situation where if a person is buried closer to December 21st, you'll see that orientation farther to the north of west. And if they're buried in the middle of the summer, you'll find that situation more stressing to the south of west as the sun varies across the sky according to the time of year. So you see a little bit of variability in this east-west orientation.
That's interesting.
There's a lot of other characteristics of Southern folk cemeteries. Usually the use of the highest ground possible is used. Women are generally buried to the left-hand side of men. People on the wife's side of the family, like her brothers or sisters, are frequently to her left. Kinship in a family cemetery, brothers and sisters of the male would generally be to the right-hand side of, let's say, the patriarch of the family.
Okay.
As things may evolve from that particular point.
How about babies? Babies and small children before the age of 2. Are they like at the foot?
There is no real set pattern as to where. I mean, they're generally. Babies generally die before the parents do, unless a woman dies in childbirth. So there is generally no set pattern as far as where they would be in relationship to anybody else. They're generally put within the family plot.
Okay.
In western North Carolina, which was populated by the Scots-Irish, the family cemetery plots are much smaller. Ashe County's cemetery research project located 960 separate cemeteries just within the county. One of the interesting things on Chincoteague Island is because of its isolation as an island, many of the cemeteries developed into multi-family cemeteries.
Okay.
One of the things you were with us when we cleaned up, the cemetery committee cleaned up the Idlet Cemetery, where some of the Whealton family is buried.
That's great.
Is that there was actually, the Idlet Cemetery actually consisted of 3 separate family burial areas that stretched on a north to south axis in there.
Okay.
And one of the more interesting things in that cemetery that we noted at the time that I pointed out to you was there was a very complete burial of a family over time, where there were brothers on the wife's brothers and sisters were on one side, and the males, brothers and sisters. So there was pretty much a straight line of these things that had occurred, and I pointed that out to you at that time. How it was one of the most consistent burial structures that I had ever seen.
Wow.
As far as that type of a people to ladies to the left, men to the right. But then her sisters and brothers, as Ellen Richardson was telling us, because she knew who a lot of these people were, she was able to say, well, that's his sister and her brother, and so on and so forth. And it kind of laid itself out on the ground pretty much the way a folk cemetery structure would be.
Very good. Very nice. Okay, how about epitaphs? Can we talk about epitaphs for a little while? As far as how did people on Chincoteague Island mark their graves before stone started coming in?
Okay. One of the more interesting things of folk cemeteries is sort of the makeshift ability to mark graves. And throughout the upland south and the lowland south, the use of indigenous materials or local materials was most often used. In this area, apparently conch shells were used. Along the Gulf Coast in Texas, apparently I have read, conch shells are also used. In the mountains, stones and, well, there's a lot of stone up there, but usually stones would be used to outline the edges of graves as well. On the island, burials started for as long as obviously people had been here.
Right.
But one of the determining things that I have noticed is that the introduction of cemetery stones, headstones, didn't occur until somewhere about 1850, 1854. Prior to that time, wood seemed to have been predominantly used for headstones, and and conch shells to outline burials. Most of these ephemeral products that disintegrate through time have been lost, and a great many of the earlier graves have been lost.
Okay.
The introduction of stone somewhere around 1850, 1854 may have coincided with the ability of the railroads to penetrate down the center of the eastern shore, and were able to bring stones, to where they were in the availability of stones for headstones.
Okay.
And it could have been that just prior to the Civil War, the rise of business as it occurred through time brought the locals into trade relations with people that were actually doing cemetery stone selling, so to speak of. So I'm sure that the two coincided with the railroad's ability to bring heavier products down through greater distances, as well as the rise of certain businesses that would cater to the funeral trade, so to speak of, introducing stones. That's kind of the way I see things. People have asked me what's the oldest grave, and the answer is not so much where's the oldest grave, but what's the earliest formal tombstone that we see. And it seems to be from Jimmy Carpenter's work, who has done a lot of cemetery research on this island, as far as the names and dates and things of people. 1854 seems to be about the earliest point.
Okay.
Interestingly, one of the things, there's a lot of things that can be discussed structurally about the cemeteries on the island, but one of the things I've noted is a very uniformity of size in headstones.
Okay.
And at first I thought it had to do with level of economic activity, that people only wanted to afford stones of a certain dollar value. But I actually came to realize that I think what is the limiting factor is the weight.
Okay.
And that it was how much a cemetery stone weighed and how it had to be hand lifted from wherever it came from the train onto a horse-drawn cart, put on a barge, brought across the bay, unloaded, recarted, and taken to the cemetery. And I think that, in my opinion, was probably one of the more determining points. Above, because in urban settings by 1854 or even in 1900, you had very, very large cemetery stones.
Okay.
I mean, especially in the 1890s. But you don't see that here on the island. And I think weight had a great deal to do with the ability to bring something over here prior to 1926, when they had the causeway. Once the causeway was developed and you could drive across, it opened things up a little bit. So that seems to be a determining point as far as stones themselves go. One of the things I've learned as far as the formal characteristics of them, especially in the late 19th century, here with the British and the English influence on the island, as opposed to Western Virginia, which had a great deal of the Scots-Irish. The Scots-Irish were not very verbose, and when you saw headstones in the late 1890s from the Scots-Irish, it was Charles Cox, 1893 CSA, and that was it. It told the man's name, when he died, that he was in the Confederate Army. But here, the Victorian era in the 1890s seems to have flourished more with the British, with the English population here on the island, because you see headstones that are far more in tune with the type of poetry and the type of feelings that people exhibited at that time. The little epitaphs that have rhymes, kind of that carpe diem sort of poetry that existed in the later 19th century. One
of my favorites is, Captain Chandler's down there by the turntable. Farewell, my wife and children dear, I am not dead but sleeping here, as I am now, so shall you be. Prepare for death and follow me. And I enjoy reading the different epitaphs here, because they do have something to say about the future, about heaven, and about going into eternity, and that they're not limited. Yeah,
I feel that the Civil War had a great deal to do with bringing people to terms with death and the acceptance of death, and then turning that acceptance of the horrors of the Civil War and the acceptance of death into something colorful and spiritual, and a way of expressing that wasn't so grave and remorse.
Right, that this is temporary.
Brought things up. Yeah. Right, and so I think that the fact that the islanders in the late 19th century embraced the Victorian period and the Victorian spirit in that style says a lot about both the Englishness of the island as well as their ability of contact with the greater culture of the eastern coast.
Yes.
This was, many people want to tell you that this was a dirt-roaded little isolated backwater, which in many respects it was. When you look at the material culture that the people left behind, you see that they were very much in tune with the flavor and the styles of that particular period.
Yes.
I'm not going to get into the architecture on the island because it's not the point of this conversation. But the fact that the islanders have continually seemed to make a point of saying, I'm just as good as you are.
Yes.
And, we might be little backward islanders with dirt roads, but I'm just as good as you are.
Yes.
And it was expressed in many respects in their funerary, in the way they expressed themselves through their tombstones. Let's
Very
put it that
interesting.
Way. So, this is something that I've seen, and this is what I like about cemetery research is that you get into the spirit of not just who these people were by their names and so on, but how they embraced the stylistic offerings of a particular time period.
Yes.
And how they picked and chose between all those different offerings, and how they used that together. When you're speaking of children earlier, by and large, there's two ways of looking at children from the tombstone head standpoint. One is, are they treated like little adults? And the other is, are they treated like children? And in the 1880s and 1890s, as people were embracing the Victorian period, they're also embracing that feeling of the child as being a child, not just a little adult. Because this is where you see a lot of the little lamb headstones and things like this. And you see in the epitaphs that expression of childlike love for them, and not just Jenny Jones, 1884, 1885.
Yes.
But you see this stylistic acceptance of seeing them as children. And, children did not live as long oftentimes as children do today. There was a higher infant mortality rate.
Well, that's what I noticed when I went with Natalie. Before she was born, I went to the different cemeteries to look for a name, to look for an old name. And that's what I noticed. A lot of babies or children died before the age of 2. It seemed like from 2 years on back to birth, there were a lot of babies that died in that age period. So, yeah.
Do you want to move on to another question? I have more to talk about, but we'll move on to another question.
Okay. Well, I want to go back to the epitaphs because I'm interested in the epitaphs.
Okay.
So if you'd speak more about that, the different language, I'd still like to hear more about that. And I'd also like to know the conch shells. A friend of mine had told me that a lot of times it didn't necessarily outline it completely, but it just had like an oval shape that marked that there was a person buried there. and not necessarily. That's why I was wondering, had you encountered a lot more that actually outlined it?
Most of the folk conch shells are now gone as far as outlining goes, at least in the main cemeteries here on the island.
Okay.
You don't see it as prevalent. If you see it, you see it only because someone has come up and done it recently.
Okay.
I mean, I have not personally seen what I would consider an intact 19th century, enclosure like that.
Okay.
I think those have pretty much dissipated through,
Right.
just natural attrition of the materials themselves.
Uh-huh.
And the ground, if they're there, the ground may have simply covered them over.
Okay.
So I have not really seen a lot of that, and really couldn't say. The ones I have generally seen kind of outline it in that basic rectangle.
Okay.
But I could not actually speak to that because I've not seen it.
Okay. The other thing too is that I've heard in the Whealton Cemetery behind the high school that they just put on their birth dates. They did not put the dates of their death.
If that's the case, now we went through. That was one of the first one. That was one of the first cemeteries we redug out.
Uh-huh.
And if you've got a situation like that, my general gut feeling was that what people did was that they bought several stones at one time, and that they simply never came back. They didn't just put the birth date. They just never came back with a stone cutter and put the date of death.
Okay, good.
Okay, so what they did was the family bought 2 or 3 stones at one particular time when they got that impetus within their family to purchase cemetery stones.
Okay.
And they bought them for the whatever, but they put when they were born, somebody simply never came back and put the date of death on it. And that's not an uncommon thing. I've seen that frequently.
Okay.
Where people have passed away and nobody has ever come back with a stone cutter to engrave the date of death for the people.
Okay.
Because sooner or later they probably did die. So it's one of those things that there's probably somebody down in there.
Now, who maintained all these cemeteries before? I know you have a cemetery committee now that goes around and cleans, but what was the ritual of the families as far as maintaining the cemeteries? Because it seems as if here on the island, the cemeteries are located in neighborhoods, just like we had neighborhood stores, and at one time they had neighborhood churches that were closer because people walked everywhere, or a horse and a cart. So who maintained all these cemeteries before this period that we're living in?
A general part of the uplands or the southern folk cemetery complex of traits is that the community maintained them, and that once or twice a year there would be a community cemetery cleanup and a dedication of the graves. We have dedications of graves going on today.
What's a dedication?
A dedication of the grave is basically a cultural act of going and putting flowers there.
Okay.
And this pretty much from a religious standpoint, cemeteries embody sacred time and sacred space.
Okay.
And it's very important culturally for a group to have sacred time and sacred space that's not necessarily embodied within the church itself. Cemeteries, folk cemeteries, normally are not associated with churches. The Anglican model, the British Anglican model, is a church with a cemetery surrounding the churchyard.
Okay.
The Southern Folk Cemetery is a cemetery by itself and a church elsewhere.
So on the island you have a mixture then, because I know some of the churches like St. Andrews, they have their cemetery.
When you have that, you generally find, well, at least in the upland south, that the cemetery predated the church itself, and that there was sometimes 2 or 3 acres that were given. The ground is what they may call sanctified, created as being sacred space.
Okay.
And a dedication is the reaffirmation of that sacred space. The simple act of putting the flowers there on the grave reaffirms the sacred space aspect
that's very interesting.
of a graveyard. One of the most interesting aspects I have ever seen, because people sometimes don't realize that culture is an ongoing process. We all participate in our culture. When the Town Cemetery Committee went over to the Mechanics Cemetery and
where is Mechanics Cemetery located?
Mechanics Cemetery is located on East Side Drive, just south or just east of the corner of Ridge and what is that? Chicken City. And where Church Street stops and the East Side Drive continues.
Right.
So it's just a little east of that.
Okay.
And the Town Cemetery Committee went over and we cleaned up this one area that had become very overgrown and very, filled with it was very overgrown. It says for itself. about a week after we had cleaned this whole area up and found stones that people hadn't seen in years and so on and so forth, I went driving by there to take a look, and people had come in and rededicated all those graves with flowers. And they had, some of these graves hadn't seen flowers in years and years, but some of the older people had gone and found the opportunity. We found these stones again and came in and they rededicated the graves by placing flowers on them.
Fantastic.
So cultures themselves, basically getting back to the question that you asked, it was part of the community project, so to speak, of whether it was conducted through churches or through families, but once or twice a year there would be a cemetery cleanup day where you would go and clean all the debris out, put the flowers on, rededicate the cemetery, whether formally with a pastor, you know, making a little dedication, or just through the simple cultural act of placing the flowers on there, rededicate the cemeteries as being a part of cultural space for the community.
Very interesting.
And so, you know, but you see that ongoing here today. So the earlier question was, that was who used to do this. The communities themselves used to maintain their own cemeteries. As time has gone on and people became busier, certainly after World War II, a lot of those cultural type of practices, people have moved off, other different people have moved in, those kind of cultural practices have gone astray.
Yes, I see that.
And so...
very interesting. Very
so that was,
interesting.
you know...
the cultural part. Bring it into it. It's
of that, yeah.
fantastic.
It's this is part of what you have to realize with cemeteries is they are a highly dynamic part of the culture of an area. There's a lot that can be read as far as the culture goes in there. Getting back to a question you asked a moment ago about epitaphs, I'll digress and then I'll move on to another little other bit of a topic here on some of the larger cemeteries you were just talking about. One of the things that I have seen in some of the epitaphs, and when we're dealing with children, is the incredible power of wanting to pass along a family name that you frequently see, especially in the late 19th, early 20th century, the same Christian given name, you know, not the surname, but you'll have, you know, Abraham died as 2 years, you know, son of Abraham and you know, Sarah, and Abraham dies as 2 years old, and then buried next to him is another Abraham who lived to be age 23, and they just keep renaming their children.
I'm laughing because that happened in my husband's
over
family.
And over
Elvie's
and
family.
over again.
Yes,
yeah.
They lost a little child. I think her name was Betty, and then the next child was named Betty.
Yeah, I know. Over and over again, you see this overwhelming cultural desire to pass along these specific family names, and some of them are, you know, Ephraim. There's a couple of them I've seen are Indiana, and you know, there was a lot of Indiana women named Indiana, but over and over again through the cemeteries, one of the things you pick up again is this overwhelming desire to pass along these family names, and if one dies out early, they just name the next kid, you know, in line that comes up with that name, you know, to have that. Son.
Another question I wanted to ask you too was, I noticed in some of the cemeteries, especially the one across from the Island Baptist Church, I think it's at the Beulah Cemetery.
Okay, yeah.
That there are pictures on the headstones. Do
Mm-hmm.
you know anything about that, or was it? I don't know. Was it only a certain period of time that they used these, or was that like a?
I think that basically this was a technological innovation of a particular time period.
Okay.
That appealed to the particular the people of that time period.
Okay.
That they did this because it was a fleeting thing. It probably only lasted 10 years.
Okay.
I mean, today what you see oftentimes are laser cuts. People's portraits in laser cuts on the stone, because that's also a technological innovation that people are using at this particular time. But whatever the technology of reproducing those photos, because they don't fade.
I noticed that. That's why
They
I was
don't
so
fade.
amazed.
They stay along.
Amazed at
Oh
it.
yeah, I mean I saw them up through the mountains.
Yeah.
But they all kind of group. If you group them temporally, they all group within a small particular period of time.
Okay.
Probably a 10 or 15 year.
And
period.
when was that? Do you have any?
I've not really studied that particular aspect of it. I mean,
I thought it was fascinating.
Yeah,
I've never seen
I'm thinking it was during the 1940s.
Okay.
Is a guess, you know. But it seemed the ones I've seen all seem to group within this particular time period. I'd have to go back and look at it. I mean, I know that there's one over here in the Redmond Cemetery on Taylor in Maine.
There are quite a few at Beulah.
Yeah, I'm sure that there are.
Yeah.
And, you know, it might have appealed to a group within a family that, you know, started a little. You know, people die off generationally. And so it's not as if dying is like furniture. You don't buy it on a steady basis. You have groups that go through where the grandparents die off, and then 10, 15, 20 years, the parents die off, and then 10 or 15 or 20 years generationally, then, the children dying off who are then the grandparents of younger kids. So you don't, while death is a steady thing, it happens, when you look at it temporally within families on a given spot, it's not, death happens to everybody all the time. But it's not a steadily occurring thing. So you have
and
a generation.
that's a problem too, though, for the cemeteries, because what happens is when that generation and that group dies out, there's no one to maintain a lot of times.
Well, that's what happens.
The cemetery, and then it becomes forgotten.
Right.
And then if the community doesn't take it over.
Yeah. If you look at things a lot of times as far as social upheavals within a particular culture, you'll find they frequently correlate with periods of war in our country. In other words, the Civil War was a great upheaval. The First World War was a great upheaval. Second World War was a great upheaval of people moving and doing lots of different things. And you find that these disbursements in an area correlate a lot of times during wartime periods. If people go away, people move off to get jobs where jobs are available, especially in rural areas. And so, you see it like a little fluctuation of groupings. You find areas where there's more, you'll have greater little concentrations in time periods. While it's a steady process of dying, they group into little areas of time.
Right.
And moving on to some of the island cemeteries themselves.
Yeah, how many cemeteries are there?
Apparently, from what we have on a list of, there are 26 cemeteries on this island. I think that count is correct. That's there again from Jimmy Carpenter's work on counting all the cemeteries and what even family grave areas apparently. But there's probably 12 to 14 larger cemeteries on this island.
Okay.
Most of those seem to be the result of social organizations in the 19th century. And this gets into what my current research project is. How are we doing on tape?
Good.
Okay. This gets into what my current research project is on island cemeteries. And that is at the end of World War II, end of the Civil War, which was a great upheaval of things. It brought forth what we spoke of earlier is this great presentation of death, so to speak of, and this great understanding people had. It dislocated a lot of men. A lot of men came here separate of families, and social organizations were like the International Order of Odd Fellows, the Masonic Lodge, the Redmond's Lodge, the Order of Mechanics, were social organizations that attracted men as a way of organizing them into economic and business relationships. And at this time, we find a lot of the larger cemeteries on the island being established. Now, I'm not sure if they were established. I have two ways of looking at it. One way of looking at it says they were established as a way of providing for themselves burial spots.
Right.
Because as they were getting, a little bit older, they realized that, well, here we're in a different area. We're not in where our family has their cemetery plots, wherever that might be, and we now have to provide for our family's cemetery plots. That's one way of looking at it, that the lodges each went out and bought plots of land.
Okay.
Another crazy way of looking at it that I've been looking into is going, like the Redmond's Lodge saying, hey, I have a fundraising idea for the group. Why don't we buy that vacant lot over there on Taylor in Maine, turn it into a cemetery, sell the lots, and make some money for the lodge. So these might have purely been money-making opportunities for the lodge at that particular time of buying, plots of land up and selling off the plots in them. And one of the things I've been working on with the Redmond's Cemetery is I want to survey the cemetery at some point and see how the earliest graves more or less plot out on the ground, so to speak of. Do they plot out? Did they start at one corner and just bury people going left? Or did they buy up, various areas, and how large are these areas and how far apart are the earliest grave plots? And what can we basically say about the structure of how that cemetery was developed?
Okay.
So that's one of the little things when I get back around to it, am intending to do is to try to understand spatially on the ground how the cemetery is developed initially.
Okay.
In the course of doing this, however, I have come up with an interesting explanation for something else. There's a lot of of surnames when you go into these cemeteries. A lot of different surnames, different names altogether.
Right.
There's an explanation I have come up for this difference in surnames, and that is that the island in the late 19th century, basically the women stayed home and the men moved away.
Right.
And in anthropological terms, it's what's known as matrilocal residency patterns. And what that was the women stayed home, the men moved away to go elsewhere, and other men moved in to marry those women.
Okay.
And that's where all these different surnames come from.
Wow. That's
when you go back to that, when we spoke earlier of that section of the Idlet Cemetery opposite from where the Whealtons are buried, all those different people, and this is this person's and that person's, all those different surnames were popped into there, names that had no connection to the island at all.
Okay.
But that was the explanation for it, is the women stay home, the men marry in from elsewhere, they bring in a whole variety of surnames.
Okay.
Up in western North Carolina and southwest Virginia, where the Scots-Irish were, it was a patrilocal residency pattern. The men stayed home and the women married in. So when you have cemeteries, you have, Kennedy or Cox or Phipps, and the predominance of those names, 75% of that little family cemetery is Phipps, for instance, or 60% are Coxes or something. There might be one break, but they'll follow just broad lines. It's because the men stayed home to tend the farm. Women married in from elsewhere. They didn't bring surnames with them.
Fantastic.
And here on this island, you see this tremendous dividing up of the population, with the men continually tended to leave, and the other men came in, sometimes bringing their brothers or their younger brothers with them. And you see this a lot of times in other sources of information. Some of that newspaper things that Rick Smith does from time to time.
Right.
He said he picks this up. David Dewey's brother joined him from Lewis, Delaware, and married the younger sister of the woman he married, or something like this, or somebody else's younger sister. But you see this repeatedly in all these cemeteries. This matrilocal residency, women staying home, men coming from outside the area and marrying into these families. This, of course, gives rise to the explanation of why there was such an interest in men's social organizations on the island, is because these guys came from all over, had no connections to one another, and the only way that they could forge working bonds and friendships with other men that they didn't know that were not family connected was through organizations like the Redmond's Lodge, or the Masonic Lodge, International Order of Oddfellow. The Mechanics was another lodge.
Mechanics, I've never heard of the Mechanics Lodge.
Yeah, it's got a full name. Jimmy Carpenter gave it to me one time. It's got a full name of the worshipful and whatever order of mechanics.
Oh, really?
And yeah, mechanics being men that worked on like boats and ships and other things, And it was a lodge on this island.
And when did it die out?
I don't know how long it was lived.
Okay.
It was during the 19th century. It could have been, the Order of Redmond actually started sometime probably in the late 1870s.
Okay.
And because by the early 1880s, there is a photograph over at the Methodist Church of the Redmond's Lodge in the early 1880s. Nice 3-story building. Okay. It took a while to get up a population of men, develop a lodge, get up enough money. It might have been, for all I know, they might have decided to develop the cemetery as a way of paying off the lodge.
Right.
As to sell on the cemetery plots. So, all these little things fit together.
Right.
I think the building burned down sometime before 1905.
Okay. Because
that in 1905 was when the Redmond's Lodge moved to Salisbury. They just celebrated their 100th anniversary.
Okay. Fantastic.
And so it wasn't as if they started from nowhere. I think that the Redmond's Lodge, once the building burned down here, they just shifted up to Salisbury, which was more of a commercial and hub.
They could pull more people.
And could pull more people. Plus, it was where the businesses were.
Right.
That was where the railroad hub was in 1905, and that's where the money was. And I think that's why the lodge went to there.
Okay.
But the Redmond's Lodge, who knows? I mean, in the work that I'm writing down, basically, I have, fantasized for the most part that, sometime in the 1870s, 8 or 10 years, sometime at the tag end of Reconstruction, somebody walked off, down the walkway of a ship with the idea of the Redmond's Lodge in his mind.
Okay.
And started that lodge, introduced that concept on this island. Whether he came from Connecticut or Boston, I don't know.
Good.
But at any rate, this all connects into the cemeteries in the later part of the 19th century and how they all got started. Was they were all the activities of lodges on the island, and those lodges developed because of this social pattern of women staying home. All ties together.
Now, a couple questions.
Sure.
Do they still bury many people on the island, or do you see a shift in people moving to the mainland for cemetery burials?
Well, most of these cemeteries are full, so most burials are moving over to the mainland because there isn't really any new room. But there are still burials. These are still active cemeteries. Paul Merritt, who was a very well-respected member of this community, was on the county commission for a long time, was just put down in Redmond Cemetery last year, or earlier, I guess in March of this year. There were 3 burials in the Redmonds Lodge this year. So there are still, and there's more to go. There's still open plots there. There are none for sale. They're all still basically within the family. Which brings up another interesting little point, because I asked the cemetery or the funeral home one time, well, how do you know where these people go? I mean, what kind of paperwork is there? And they said there isn't any paperwork anymore. It's just simply family oral tradition that they own certain cemetery plots, and that's where Grandpa is, and that's where that's where Mom goes when she dies, and that we own this plot left. And these are still, you've got to look at cemetery plots as being little bits of real property that have economic value and can be traded and swapped and used as real property, and that's still being done. Sometimes if there's an earlier death, sometimes people will swap around a cemetery plot, or they'll own a couple of them still. And sometimes people die and get buried elsewhere. Men that move away and start families elsewhere that may have part of a family plot here don't always get shipped back for burial here. So that opens up a plot. But so these are still being traded and used. But no, people are still being put into the island cemeteries. It's just that there's no new cemeteries being developed. There's no new areas for people. So the most people that die on the island today that don't have a plot or family connections to one are being put over on the mainland where there is open space.
Okay. Now, what happens land-wise, where a lot of these cemeteries are actually on real estate that is owned by people? How do they work that? In other words, if I have somebody who lives on somebody's land, their cemetery after they're buried on someone else's land, how does that work?
They are, by the law in the state of Virginia, they are legally entitled to the right of personal property to that burial spot. This is a legal right that has to be enforced by the local municipal authority, as it's referred to in the statutes of Virginia. And you can partition the court to have them moved if necessary. Okay. But if you purchase a piece of property and there are existing burials on there, it is incumbent of you under the laws of the state of Virginia to respect those people's personal property rights of burial. You do not have a right to move them or bulldoze them over or anything else. This is a legal right that is passed through time, so to speak, of by the right of whether you purchase the plot from a burial organization or whether you're interned in a family plot of 3 or 4, 5 graves, there is still a legal right of personal property. Okay, now the people that recognized
in the family, do they have a right of way? I mean, can they come to visit the grave? How does that work?
They have a legal right, according to the statutes in the state of Virginia. They can go see them. You have to ask for permission, but you can't. I mean, you can't trespass across someone's land, but you have the right. You have to go ask them for permission. But they basically cannot deny you the right of access to a family plot, the right of passage to a plot, according to the law in the state of Virginia.
Good.
So, this was recently brought up because we're having a spat of septic tanks being put into cemeteries on the island. And so we, basically looked into the laws in the state of Virginia. And you have legal rights when you purchase a cemetery plot. I mean, it's a right of possession, of course, but it's a legal right that is protected under the law.
If you could you explain imaging in the cemetery realm to me, please?
All right. Largely what we think of when I use the term of imaging oneself, it's kind of a joke. I mean, it's not a joke really, but this is your last best shot to image yourself for posterity. I recall a conversation I had one time with a pastor at a church that had a cemetery out behind it. It was a Baptist church up in the mountains. And I kind of pointed out, I said, that guy right there, he's got a huge tombstone. He's right behind the back door of the church. You see, it could have been the biggest booger in the whole neighborhood, but there he is, and he's imaged himself very well for posterity. But the whole concept of imaging is pretty much how your tombstone looks in relationship to others within the cemetery, as well as how your family, oftentimes you don't really have the say of what you get. Sometimes people buy ahead for themselves, but oftentimes it's how the family, when you pass on, how the family wants to see their legacy remembered in your headstone. So frequently, families will buy up a little bit to image, loved ones a little bit better, depending on what their circumstances are at the time. But at any rate, people image themselves in a variety of different ways. I was pointing out that families frequently image a loved one according to the social status of the family rather than the way that the deceased saw themselves. Frequently, people image themselves according to organizations or affiliations that they had through their life. Frequently, certainly on this island, you see the social organizations that existed represented in symbols on headstones.
Yes.
You see that very frequently you see the Masonic square and caliper, or whatever they call it. And frequently you also see the three circles interlinking, which is the International Order of Oddfellow. Okay. You see the Order of the Eastern Star for women, and then like I mentioned earlier in the discussion, in Western North Carolina, because the Civil War did not touch here, you do not see representations of the Civil War. You do see other military rankings and things where people had been in the military for whatever reason. Interestingly, though, on this island, this is an island that sits 4 miles off the coast of Virginia that is predominantly overwhelmed by the sea. Yet when you look through the cemetery stones and things like this, it's very rare do you ever see that kind of representation included on the headstones. I've seen a couple of examples of earlier sailing ships and things, and occasionally the name of Captain such and such. But for an island that it is dominated by life at sea, especially up just recently, you really don't see this represented in the imaging of people. Imaging people, there again, image themselves in the mainstream. We talked about imaging themselves in the view of the Victorian period. You see them imaging themselves in relationship to one another. In other words, people felt very egalitarian. There's no social hierarchy that goes on this particular island as far as the size of tombstones and things go. All the stones, while it may have been a weight factor, people did not want to image themselves differently than their neighbors. People felt they were not better than, but equal to everybody else. Right. And so there's a lot of, when you look across the stones in the cemeteries, there's a very uniform nature to a lot of it, even though what varies more than anything else is the time period that the materials were purchased in, not the economic status of the individual. Even the very wealthy people have very modest stones on this island. So, you have rankings from other ways of looking at things. People image themselves in relationship to the rest of their community the way they felt that a lot of times their neighbors wanted to see them.
Lucy is here with us. I should let you know, Lucy is a darling 7-week-old German Shepherd puppy.
Who just woke up. So, who knows what we'll get into at this point. We have company. The other thing we wanted to talk about quick, because we'll try to draw this to a close, was blacks on the island. Yes. And the images of where blacks are. In the Redmond Cemetery, I don't know, you have to look to find these. There's a headstone that's possibly one of the earliest headstones, and the only thing it says on it is Cora, and it's a small heart, maybe 12 inches by 12 inches headstone, and all it says on it is Cora, 1856 to 1883. Wow. And 1856 puts Cora certainly squarely within the slavery period of time. Cora Welch, it's the only stone I've ever seen without a surname.
Oh, wow.
And Cora, most likely, in my opinion, was a slave, possibly an orphan slave.
Uh-huh.
But someone felt enough for this person when they passed away at age 32 or 33 to purchase them a headstone.
Wow.
And show that they were loved.
Uh-huh.
But the only thing it says is Cora on it. And
Cora comes from the word cœur, which means heart in French.
okay, well, there's a heart right there. That's interesting. I didn't realize that. There are blacks, apparently, that I have been told, that are buried in the International Order of Oddfellow Cemetery. It's always kind of referred to as the Black Cemetery on the island.
Okay.
Blacks obviously
Where is that located?
That is located on Willow Street. There's a sequence of cemeteries that run along Willow Street, probably because of its of a high ridge that runs along the island and through there.
Right.
And there's a series of cemeteries that runs all the way down the island, on and off along that ridge. And this is just one of those cemeteries in there, and it's designated as the International Order of Oddfellow Cemetery.
Okay.
And I've been told, I do not know much about that at this point, but I've been told that was where the blacks were buried at that time.
Okay.
So,
Right. And we'll draw this to a close because both of us are getting hungry, and I've really enjoyed my time talking to you about the cemeteries. You are a wealth of knowledge in this area, and there are very few people that I encounter that know that much. They might know who's buried where, but to actually understand the structures and the history behind it, it's very fascinating. So I thank you for your time.
I hope I've helped out and I've pushed the project on a little bit and helped contribute some more to understanding that this actually is a very unique situation here on this island as far as cemetery research goes. It's the only repository of continuous history from the 1850s to present that exists on this island. There was no other single source of history outside of what people have in their minds. But from a material culture standpoint, it's the only repository this island has left of a continuous flow of history.
Wow.
So, it's a worthy topic of further consideration.
Yes, and we want to make sure that we're able to pass it on to the next generation so it's not lost.
Exactly. Sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.